The wagon wheel cracked against the fence post, and the whole yard exploded into chaos. Onyx reared up, his front legs slicing through the morning air, and the rope around his neck snapped like a piece of thread. Soldiers scattered in every direction. A crate of supplies tipped over and spilled apples across the mud. Somewhere behind the barn, a rooster screamed and flew into the rafters. "Hold him! Hold him now!" shouted Edward Barlow, the camp's commanding officer, as he ran toward the animal with 3 other men close behind. But nobody could hold Onyx. Nobody ever could. He was the largest horse anyone at Camp Ashford had ever seen. A deep black animal with a chest like a wall and eyes that seemed to burn even in the gray morning light. His mane was tangled and wild, his hooves scarred from old battles, and his temper was worse than any weapon in the camp's storehouse. He did not run from danger. He ran toward it, and he did not stop for anyone. A young soldier named Peter Doyle tried to grab the loose end of the rope. Onyx swung his massive head and sent Peter flying backward into a stack of hay bales. Peter groaned, sat up slowly, and waved a hand to show he was not badly hurt, but his face had gone pale. "Everyone back," Barlow ordered. "Clear the yard." The men obeyed at once. Nobody argued with Barlow when his voice took that tone, and nobody wanted to be the next person thrown across the yard by an angry horse the size of a small barn. Onyx stood in the center of the open space, breathing hard, his sides heaving, his nostrils flaring wide. He turned in a slow circle, watching every human around him as if they were enemies waiting to strike. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the wind pushing through the fence posts and the distant clatter of pots from the camp kitchen, where the cooks had no idea what was happening outside. It had been almost a year since Onyx arrived at Camp Ashford, and in that year, he had thrown off 3 different handlers, broken 2 gates, destroyed a wagon, and injured more soldiers than anyone wanted to count. He had been found wandering near the edge of a battlefield, alone, without a rider, dragging a broken harness behind him. Nobody knew where he came from. Nobody knew who he had belonged to. All anyone knew was that he was strong enough to pull heavy supply wagons for miles without tiring, and that made him valuable, even if he refused to let a single person control him. Barlow raised a hand slowly, palm open, and took one careful step forward. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "Easy now." Onyx's ears flattened against his head. He stamped one hoof hard into the mud, and the sound echoed across the yard like a drumbeat. Barlow stopped walking. He had faced enemy soldiers on open ground without flinching, but there was something about this horse that made even a brave man think twice. It was not just his size. It was the way he looked at people, as if he understood exactly what they wanted from him, and had already decided the answer was no. "Get the ropes," Barlow said quietly to the man beside him. "2 more. We circle him from both sides." 2 soldiers ran to fetch heavy ropes from the storehouse. While they were gone, nobody in the yard dared to move. Onyx paced back and forth, his breath rising in small clouds in the cool morning air, his dark eyes flicking from one face to another. A woman named Grace Whitmore stood near the fence, watching everything with sharp, careful eyes. She had arrived at the camp only 3 days earlier, sent from a neighboring outpost because she was known as one of the best horse trainers in the region. She had tamed animals that other trainers had given up on, animals that bit, animals that kicked, animals that refused to eat unless they were left completely alone. But even she had never seen a horse behave quite like this one. "He's not just frightened," she said under her breath. "He's furious." Barlow glanced at her. "Can you explain the difference?" "A frightened animal wants to escape," Grace said. "This one wants to fight. There's a difference, and it matters." The 2 soldiers returned with the ropes, and Barlow motioned for them to spread out along the fence line. Slowly, carefully, the men began to circle Onyx, keeping a wide distance, waiting for the right moment. The horse watched them all, turning his body to keep as many humans in view as possible, refusing to let anyone get behind him. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wind blew, the rooster on the barn roof settled down and stopped screaming. Somewhere far off, a bell rang twice, marking the hour. Then Onyx made his move. He charged straight for the gap between two soldiers, his hooves tearing up mud with every stride. The men dove out of the way just in time, and for one terrifying second, it looked like the horse would break through the fence entirely and vanish into the open fields beyond the camp. But Barlow had expected this. He had left one section of the fence reinforced with an extra beam, and when Onyx slammed into it, the wood held. The horse staggered back, shaking his massive head, momentarily stunned. "Now!" Barlow shouted. The soldiers threw their ropes at once. One loop caught around Onyx's neck, another caught around his front leg. The horse screamed, a sound so loud it echoed off the surrounding hills, and he fought against the ropes with everything he had, dragging two grown men through the mud as if they weighed nothing at all. But there were 4 ropes now, then 5, and slowly, painfully, the animal's wild strength began to be matched by sheer numbers. It took almost 20 minutes to finally bring Onyx to a standstill, his sides heaving, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth, his legs trembling from exhaustion rather than surrender. He stood in the middle of the yard, held by ropes on every side, glaring at the humans around him with an anger that had not faded even slightly. Barlow walked closer this time, slow and steady, until he was near enough to look the horse directly in the eye. "You are the most difficult animal I have ever met," he said quietly. Onyx snorted and stamped his hoof again, but he did not lunge. He simply stood there, trapped, breathing hard, watching Barlow with an expression that seemed almost like a challenge. Grace stepped up beside Barlow, keeping a respectful distance from the horse's reach. "He's not broken," she said. "He's just tired right now. Tomorrow, he'll be exactly the same." "I know," Barlow said. He rubbed a hand across his tired face. "This cannot continue. He's injured 3 men already. Today, he nearly injured a 4th. If he cannot be controlled, he cannot stay in this camp." "What happens to a horse that cannot be controlled?" Grace asked, though she already suspected the answer. Barlow did not look at her when he replied. "He gets sent where controlling him no longer matters. The front line needs animals for the heaviest, most dangerous transport routes. Nobody expects those horses to last very long out there, but at least his strength would be put to use before the end." Grace's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She looked past Barlow, toward Onyx, who stood trembling in the ropes, his black coat streaked with mud and sweat, his proud head still raised despite everything that had just happened to him. "Give me time," she finally said. 2 weeks. Let me try to reach him before you decide his future." Barlow studied her for a long moment. Grace Whitmore had a reputation, and reputations were sometimes the only currency that mattered in a place like Camp Ashford. 2 weeks, Barlow agreed. Not a day more. As the soldiers slowly led Onyx back toward the reinforced pen at the edge of the camp, his hooves dragging heavy trails through the mud, a small figure watched everything from behind the corner of the kitchen building. She was barely visible in the shadow of the wall, a thin girl with tangled brown hair and eyes far too watchful for someone her age. She had seen the whole thing, the charge, the ropes, the way the horse fought until his legs shook beneath him rather than give in. And she had noticed something nobody else in that yard seemed to notice at all. On the side of Onyx's neck, mostly hidden beneath the tangled mane, there was a faint mark burned into his skin, old and faded, but still visible if you knew exactly where to look. The girl's breath caught in her throat. She had seen that exact mark before, a long time ago, on a much smaller, much gentler horse that used to nuzzle apples out of her palm in a quiet barn that no longer existed. She stepped back into the shadows before anyone could notice her standing there, her heart pounding, her mind racing, with a memory she had tried very hard to forget. Nobody in the yard knew her name yet. Nobody knew she had a reason to care about that horse more than anyone else in the entire camp. But she knew, and from that moment on, everything about Camp Ashford and about the beast nobody could tame was about to change. Grace Whitmore did not sleep well that first night. She lay awake in the small wooden room she had been given near the stables, listening to the wind move through the camp, thinking about the way Onyx had looked at her across the yard. Most difficult animals she had trained over the years carried fear somewhere behind their anger, a fear she could work with, slowly, patiently, until trust replaced it. But she had not seen fear in Onyx's eyes. She had seen something closer to grief, buried so deep under rage that it barely showed itself at all. She rose before sunrise and walked to the reinforced pen at the edge of the camp, carrying nothing but a small bucket of water and a handful of dried grain. The morning air was cold, and mist clung low to the ground, curling around the fence posts like smoke. Onyx stood in the far corner of the pen, watching her approach. He did not move, but his ears turned toward her, tracking every step she took. "Good morning," Grace said softly, stopping well outside the fence line. "I'm not here to rope you today." The horse snorted and shifted his weight, but he did not retreat further. Grace set the bucket down near the fence and stepped back several paces, giving him space. Then she sat down on an overturned crate and waited. She did not call to him. She did not reach toward him. She simply sat, still and quiet, letting the animal decide what to do with her presence. For almost an hour, nothing happened. Onyx paced the far side of his pen, glancing at her occasionally, but never approaching the water she had left. Grace did not move. She had learned long ago that patience was the only currency that worked with animals who had stopped trusting people entirely. When the sun finally rose high enough to warm the yard, Grace stood, gathered her empty hands, and walked away without a word. She would return that afternoon, and the afternoon after that, and the one after that, for as long as it took. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Grace tried different approaches, each one carefully chosen from years of experience with difficult animals. On the second day, she brought a rope and tried the traditional method, standing at a safe distance and slowly working to guide Onyx into accepting a lead line around his neck. He allowed her to get closer than the soldiers ever had, but the moment the rope touched his skin, he exploded into motion, tearing it from her hands and retreating to the far corner of the pen, his whole body trembling with anger. Grace did not push further. She simply gathered the rope and left. On the fourth day, she tried isolation, believing that perhaps the constant presence of soldiers and camp noise was keeping the horse in a permanent state of alarm. She arranged for Onyx to be moved to a quiet pen near the edge of the tree line, away from the clatter of the main camp. For a full day, nobody approached him at all, but when Grace returned the next morning, she found the horse had spent the night pacing endlessly along the fence, wearing a deep track into the earth, his eyes wild, with something that looked less like calm and more like panic. Isolation, it seemed, only made things worse. Whatever had happened to this animal before he arrived at Camp Ashford, being left completely alone reminded him of it in a way that terrified him. She moved him back to the main pen that same afternoon. On the seventh day, she tried gentleness, speaking to him in a soft, steady voice for hours at a time, offering treats through the fence, humming quiet tunes as she worked nearby on other tasks. Onyx tolerated her presence more each day, standing closer to the fence line than before, watching her with something that was no longer pure hostility. But whenever she reached even slightly toward him, whenever her hand crossed some invisible line, only he seemed to know the location of, he would flinch backward as though struck, his whole body flooding with a fear so sudden and so complete that it startled even Grace, who had seen frightened animals before, but never quite like this. Word of her efforts spread quickly through the camp. Soldiers gathered near the fence during their free hours, some placing quiet bets on how long she would last before giving up entirely, as the others had. Peter Doyle, still nursing a bruise from his encounter with the horse days earlier, watched from a distance but never mocked her the way some of the others did. He had seen something in the way Onyx moved that made him uneasy, something that felt less like simple stubbornness and more like pain. On the 9th day, disaster nearly struck again. Grace had grown confident enough to enter the pen itself, moving slowly along the fence line while Onyx grazed at the far end, seemingly calm for the first time since his capture. She took one step too many, crossing too close to his flank, and the horse spun with terrifying speed, his back legs kicking out in a powerful arc that missed Grace's shoulder by less than a hand's width. She stumbled backward and fell hard against the fence. The wind knocked from her lungs, while Onyx retreated to the corner, snorting and stamping, clearly as shaken by the moment as she was. Barlow arrived within minutes, having heard the commotion from across the camp. He found Grace sitting in the mud, unharmed but pale, staring at the horse with an expression that was somehow more thoughtful than frightened. "That's enough," Barlow said firmly, helping her to her feet. "You've given this everything you have. Nobody can say otherwise. But I cannot risk losing a trainer to an animal that refuses every method we try." "Give me the full 2 weeks," Grace said, brushing mud from her sleeves. "You promised me 2 weeks." "I promised you a chance to reach him," Barlow said, "not a chance to be trampled." "There's something about him," Grace insisted, glancing back toward the pen, where Onyx now stood watching them both, his sides still heaving from the sudden burst of movement. "This isn't ordinary stubbornness. Something happened to this animal, something before he ever came here." Barlow followed her gaze toward the horse. He was silent for a long moment, considering. "There was a mark on him when the scouts brought him in," Barlow admitted finally. "A brand, faded, on the side of his neck. Nobody could identify it. We assumed he came from some estate or farm that was overtaken during the fighting, but there were no records, no owners left to claim him." Grace's eyes narrowed slightly. "What did the mark look like?" Barlow shrugged. "I don't remember exactly. A simple shape. Some kind of farm mark, I imagine. It didn't seem important at the time. We had more urgent matters than tracking down the history of a stray animal." Grace turned back toward the pen, studying Onyx's neck from a distance, though the mane covered the mark too thoroughly to see clearly from where she stood. "It might matter more than you think," she said quietly. Barlow sighed and rubbed his temples. The camp had enough problems without chasing after the history of one horse, however unusual his behavior. Supplies were running lower each week. The war outside the camp's borders showed no sign of slowing, and every soldier injured by an animal that refused to work was a soldier who could not be doing something useful instead. 5 days, Barlow said. "That's what remains of your 2 weeks. If nothing changes by then, he goes to frontline transport." "I'm sorry, Grace, but I cannot keep an animal this dangerous simply because you believe there's a reason behind his anger. Reasons do not make him safe." Grace did not argue further. She simply nodded and turned back toward the pen, where Onyx stood watching her with those same dark, unreadable eyes. That evening, as the camp settled into its usual quiet routines, kitchen fires burning low and soldiers gathering for their evening meals, Grace remained near the fence long after the sun had set, wrapped in a heavy coat against the cooling air. She was not trying to approach the horse anymore. She simply wanted to watch him, to understand him, before the small amount of time she had left ran out completely. She did not notice the thin figure moving quietly along the shadows near the kitchen building, slipping past the evening bustle unnoticed, carrying something small and round, hidden inside a fold of fabric. The girl had been watching Grace's efforts every single day, from a distance, never close enough to be seen, learning everything the trainer tried and everything that failed. She understood something Grace did not yet know, something that explained exactly why every rope, every method, every careful approach had ended the same way. Onyx was not simply resisting captivity. He was waiting for someone he recognized to come back for him. And the girl in the shadows knew that she was the only person left in the world who might be able to give him that. She waited until Grace finally rose from her spot near the fence and walked back toward her quarters, her shoulders low, with the weight of another difficult day. Only when the yard stood empty and quiet, lit by nothing but a thin sliver of moon, did the girl step forward from the shadows and approach the fence herself, moving slower and more carefully than anyone in the camp had ever moved around that horse before. Onyx lifted his head, the moment she came into view, his ears swiveling forward with sudden, sharp attention. The girl stopped several steps from the fence, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the horse could hear it. She reached into the fold of fabric she carried and pulled out a single apple, small and slightly bruised from being hidden in her pocket all day. She did not speak. She did not move any closer. She simply held the apple out toward the fence, her small hand trembling slightly in the cool night air, and waited. For a long moment, Onyx did not move either. He stood perfectly still, watching her with an intensity that seemed to hold the whole night silent around them. Then, slowly, cautiously, he took one step forward. Her name was Lily Hartman, and she had arrived at Camp Ashford 3 months earlier, brought in by a supply convoy that found her wandering alone near the ruins of what used to be her family's farm. She was 10 years old, small for her age, with quick eyes that missed nothing, and a habit of staying silent, even when adults asked her direct questions. Nobody at the camp knew much about her past. She worked in the kitchens, peeling vegetables and carrying water, and she slept in a small storage room near the back of the mess hall that the cooks had cleared out for her. She caused no trouble. She asked for nothing. Most people in the camp had simply stopped noticing her at all, which was exactly the way Lily preferred it. But every night, once the kitchen fires were banked and the last soldiers had wandered off to their bunks, Lily slipped out into the darkness and made her way to the fence at the edge of the camp, where the horse everyone feared stood waiting in his pen. That first apple had taken almost 15 minutes to reach his mouth. He had approached slowly, stopped twice to retreat several steps, circled wide around her outstretched hand, before finally, carefully, lowering his head and taking the fruit from her palm with lips softer than anyone at the camp would have believed possible. Lily had not moved, had not smiled, had not made a single sound. She understood something the soldiers and even Grace had not yet realized. This horse did not need commands or ropes or careful training methods. He needed time and silence, and someone who was not afraid of him, but also did not need anything from him in return. The second night, she brought 2 apples. The horse came to the fence more quickly this time, his ears forward, his eyes calmer than they had been the night before. Lily still said nothing, still kept her movements slow and careful, but she allowed herself to stay a few minutes longer, sitting quietly on the ground just outside the fence while he ate. By the 5th night, Onyx no longer waited for her to offer food before approaching the fence. He would already be standing there when she arrived, watching the shadows for her small shape to appear, his tail flicking gently rather than lashing with anger. By the 8th night, she had begun speaking to him in a whisper so quiet that even she could barely hear her own words. She told him about the farm, about the barn where she used to sleep on warm afternoons listening to the sound of horses breathing nearby, about the sister who used to braid ribbons into the manes of their gentlest animals, about her older brother who spent every spare hour of his childhood caring for the horses their family kept. She did not tell him everything. Some parts of the story were still too difficult to speak aloud, even in a whisper meant only for an animal who could not understand her words. But something in her voice seemed to reach him anyway, because each night he stood a little closer to the fence, lowered his head a little further, allowed the space between them to shrink by careful, patient inches. On the 12th night, Lily reached through the fence and touched his neck for the first time. Onyx flinched, his whole body tensing, but he did not pull away. He stood perfectly still, trembling slightly, as her small hand moved gently along the coarse hair of his mane. Lily felt tears gathering in her eyes, though she could not have explained exactly why, and she kept her hand there for a long moment before finally withdrawing it and stepping back into the shadows. She did not know, could not have known, that her fingers had passed directly over the faded brand hidden beneath his mane, the same mark that had caught her attention on the very first day she saw him being dragged back into his pen after his failed escape. It was on the 14th night, with only a single day remaining before Grace's deadline, that Grace Whitmore finally discovered her. Grace had taken to walking the perimeter of the camp late at night, unable to sleep, turning over every failed method in her mind, searching for something, anything, she might have missed. She rounded the corner, near the reinforced pen, just after midnight, and stopped dead in her tracks. There, in the pale moonlight, stood Onyx, calm and quiet, his massive head lowered so that his nose nearly touched the top of a small girl's head. The girl stood with one hand resting against his neck, murmuring something too quiet to hear, while the horse who had thrown grown men across the yard, who had fought against 5 ropes at once, stood as still and gentle as a lamb. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She did not move, did not speak, terrified that any sudden sound might shatter whatever fragile trust had been built in front of her. She watched for several minutes, hardly daring to breathe, as the girl continued speaking softly to the horse, occasionally reaching up to stroke the side of his face, occasionally simply standing beside him in silence. When the girl finally stepped back and turned to leave, gathering her empty apple sack, Grace stepped out from the shadows, careful to move slowly. Lily froze the moment she saw her, eyes wide with fear, clearly expecting to be scolded or dragged away. "Wait," Grace said softly, holding up both hands to show she meant no harm. "Please, I'm not going to hurt you, and I'm not going to tell anyone what I just saw. Not yet." Lily said nothing, but she did not run either, watching Grace with the same cautious, careful eyes she used on every adult in the camp. "How long have you been coming here?" Grace asked. Still silence. Grace glanced toward Onyx, who stood watching the two of them with an alertness that had nothing to do with fear this time. He seemed almost protective, positioning himself slightly between Lily and the fence where Grace stood. "He trusts you," Grace said quietly, almost to herself. "In 2 weeks, I could not get within 3 steps of him without being kicked, and you're standing there with your hand on his neck like he's a farm pony." Lily finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's not dangerous. He's just scared. Everybody keeps trying to make him do things. Nobody just lets him decide on his own." Grace studied the girl carefully. There was something in the way she spoke about the horse, a familiarity that went beyond 2 weeks of careful visits. "Do you know something about him?" Grace asked. "Something about where he came from?" Lily hesitated. For a long moment, it looked as though she might turn and run rather than answer, but something in Grace's expression, a genuine curiosity rather than suspicion, seemed to convince her to stay. "I think I might," Lily admitted finally, "but I'm not sure yet. I need more time." "You don't have more time," Grace said, and immediately regretted the sharpness in her voice when she saw the girl flinch. She softened her tone. "I'm sorry. What I mean is, tomorrow, the camp commander is sending him away, to the front line, unless something changes before then. If you know something that could help, I need you to tell me now." Lily's eyes widened with alarm. She turned to look at Onyx, who had moved even closer to the fence, as though sensing the tension in her voice. "They can't take him," Lily said, her calm demeanor finally cracking. "He's not what everyone thinks he is. He used to be gentle. He used to let children ride on his back through the fields. He used to—" She stopped abruptly, pressing her lips together as though she had said more than she intended. Grace stepped closer, careful to keep her movements slow so as not to alarm the horse. "Lily, where did you know him from?" For a long moment, the girl said nothing at all. Then, very quietly, she said, "My family had a farm, before the fighting came through our valley. We kept horses, good ones, gentle ones. My brother raised one of them from the time it was born, fed it by hand every single day, slept in the barn beside it more nights than he slept in his own bed." Her voice began to tremble. "When the soldiers came through gathering horses for the war, they took him. My brother tried to stop them, but there was nothing he could do. That was the last time any of us saw that horse." Grace felt something cold settle in her chest as the pieces began falling into place. "The mark," she said slowly, "the brand on his neck." Lily nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks despite her efforts to hold them back. "It's our family's mark. I saw it the very first day he arrived here, when the soldiers dragged him back into his pen after he tried to run. I knew him the moment I saw that mark, even underneath all the mud and the anger in his eyes. "What happened to your family?" Grace asked gently, though she suspected she already understood at least part of the answer. Lily wiped at her face with the back of her sleeve. "The fighting reached our valley, not long after the horses were taken. Our farm was destroyed. My parents sent me away with a neighbor's family, hoping to keep me safe, but we were separated during the journey, and I never found them again. I don't know where my brother is. I don't know if he's even still alive." Her voice cracked on the last words, and she pressed a hand against her mouth to stop herself from crying further. Grace's heart ached at the story, but she forced herself to focus on the more immediate problem. "This horse," she said carefully. "Do you know his name? His real name? The one your family gave him?" Lily nodded slowly. "My brother named him the day he was born. He said the horse's coat reminded him of dark grain in autumn, so he called him Barley." Grace looked toward the horse, who stood watching them both, with an expression that, for the first time since his arrival at Camp Ashford, looked less like anger and more like quiet, patient waiting. "Barley," Grace repeated softly, testing the sound of the name. The horse's ears flicked forward at the sound, and he took a small step closer to the fence, as though the word itself carried some kind of weight he recognized even from a distance. Grace turned back to Lily, her mind racing through everything she had just learned. "This changes things," she said, "but I don't know if it will be enough to convince the commander by tomorrow. He's already decided. He believes the horse is simply too dangerous to keep, regardless of the reasons behind his behavior." "Then we have to show him," Lily said, her voice suddenly firm, despite the tears still drying on her cheeks. "We have to show him that Barley isn't dangerous at all, that he just needed someone to remember him." Grace studied the girl for a long moment, seeing something in her that she recognized from her own younger years, a stubbornness born not from foolishness, but from love, the kind of love that refused to give up, even when everything around it insisted there was no reason left to try. "Tomorrow will not be easy," Grace warned. "The commander has already arranged for a transport wagon to arrive at midday. There will be soldiers, noise, exactly the kind of chaos that has caused problems before. I cannot promise that Barley will stay calm, even with you nearby." "I have to try," Lily said simply. "He's the only piece of my family I have left. I can't just let them take him away too." Grace nodded slowly, understanding settling over her like a heavy blanket. She glanced once more at the horse, standing quiet and calm in the moonlight beside the small girl, who had somehow succeeded where every soldier, every rope, and every careful training method had failed. "Get some rest," Grace said finally. "Tomorrow is going to be difficult, and you will need to be ready for whatever happens." Lily nodded, though from the look in her eyes, Grace doubted the girl would sleep at all that night. As Grace turned to walk back toward her quarters, she glanced over her shoulder one final time and saw Lily standing beside the fence, one hand resting gently against Barley's neck, her small shape dwarfed by the massive animal beside her, and yet somehow, in that moment, it was clear exactly who was truly in control. The moon climbed higher over Camp Ashford, casting long silver shadows across the quiet yard, while inside the reinforced pen, a horse the entire camp believed could never be tamed rested his head gently against the shoulder of the one person in the world who still remembered his real name. Tomorrow would bring the hardest test either of them had ever faced. But for tonight, at least, Barley was not alone anymore. The transport wagon rolled into Camp Ashford just before midday, its heavy wheels grinding through the mud, pulled by two tired horses and driven by a soldier Lily had never seen before. She stood near the kitchen building, watching it arrive, her stomach twisting into a tight knot of fear. Word had already spread through the camp that the difficult black horse was finally being sent away, and a small crowd had gathered near the pen to watch, some out of curiosity, some simply relieved that the danger would soon belong to someone else's problem. Peter Doyle stood near the fence with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Grace stood closer to the pen itself, her face tense, her eyes scanning the gathering crowd for Lily. Barlow arrived a few minutes later, walking with the brisk, purposeful stride of a man who had already made his decision and did not intend to revisit it. He nodded once toward the driver of the transport wagon and gestured toward the pen. "Let's get this done quickly," he said. "The sooner he's loaded, the sooner we can put this whole difficult situation behind us." Grace stepped forward. "Sir, I need to speak with you before this proceeds." Barlow glanced at her, clearly impatient. "Grace, we've discussed this. Your time was up yesterday. I understand your effort, truly, but I cannot risk further injuries over an animal that refuses to change." "There's something you don't know," Grace said quickly. "Something that could change everything." Barlow sighed, but something in Grace's tone made him pause. "You have 1 minute." Before Grace could speak further, a commotion arose near the pen. 2 soldiers had approached the fence with ropes in hand, preparing to begin the process of loading Barley into the transport wagon. The moment the ropes appeared, the horse's calm demeanor vanished entirely. He reared back, his eyes wide with sudden panic, and began pacing the length of the pen with the same desperate energy he had shown on the very first day he arrived at the camp. "Wait!" Grace shouted, but it was too late. One of the soldiers had already climbed the fence, attempting to loop a rope over the horse's neck. Barley spun away violently, slamming his shoulder into the fence post with such force that the wood cracked and splintered. The soldier lost his footing and fell backward into the mud, and the crowd surged backward in alarm. "Get that fence secured," Barlow shouted, striding toward the pen himself. Barley continued to panic, throwing his weight against every side of the pen, his hooves tearing deep gouges into the ground. The cracked fence post groaned under the pressure, and with one final, powerful strike, it gave way entirely. The horse burst through the broken section and into the open yard, scattering soldiers and onlookers in every direction. "Everyone back!" Barlow bellowed. "Clear the area now!" Chaos erupted across the camp. Soldiers scrambled for cover behind crates and wagons. Someone knocked over a bucket of water, sending it splashing across the mud. Barley charged toward the open gate near the main road, his path blocked only by a hastily assembled line of soldiers who had grabbed ropes and poles in a desperate attempt to redirect him. Grace pushed through the panicking crowd, searching desperately for Lily, praying the girl had stayed safely away from the chaos. But when she finally spotted her, Grace's heart nearly stopped entirely. Lily was running directly toward the panicked horse, ignoring every shout from the soldiers around her, ignoring Grace's own desperate cry of her name. "Lily, stop! Get back!" Grace screamed, but the girl did not slow down. Barley spun in a tight circle near the center of the yard, cornered now by soldiers on nearly every side, his eyes wild, his massive body shaking with a terror that had nothing to do with courage or defiance, and everything to do with pure, overwhelming panic. He reared up on his hind legs, and for one horrifying moment, it looked as though he might come down directly on top of one of the soldiers standing too close. "Move!" Barlow shouted, already reaching for a length of heavy rope, prepared to do whatever necessary to bring the animal under control before someone was seriously hurt. It was in that exact moment, with the entire camp holding its breath, with soldiers frozen mid-motion and Barlow's hand tightening around the rope, that Lily broke through the last line of onlookers and stepped directly into the open space where Barley stood rearing above the ground. "No!" Grace screamed, lunging forward, but she was too far away to stop what was already happening. Barley's front hooves came down hard, striking the ground just inches from where Lily now stood, her small frame utterly still amid the chaos surrounding her. The horse froze, his enormous body trembling, his breath coming in ragged, panicked bursts, his eyes locked onto the small figure who had appeared directly in front of him. Every soldier in the yard stood frozen, too stunned and too terrified to move, certain that any sudden action might trigger the very disaster they were desperately trying to prevent. Lily did not run. She did not flinch. She lifted her chin slightly, looked directly into the wild, frightened eyes of the horse towering above her, and took one slow, careful step closer. "Lily," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself, terrified to make any sound louder than a breath. The girl reached up with one small, trembling hand and rested it gently against the horse's heaving chest. And then, in a voice so quiet that only the horse standing directly above her could possibly have heard it, she whispered a single word. Barley. The effect was immediate and impossible to explain to anyone who had not witnessed it firsthand. The horse's entire body went still, as though every muscle had simultaneously released a tension it had carried for longer than anyone could imagine. His wild, panicked eyes softened, focusing entirely on the small girl standing beneath him. His ragged breathing slowed. The trembling in his massive frame quieted into something closer to stillness. Slowly, gently, Barley lowered his great head until it rested directly against Lily's shoulder, his nose brushing softly against her hair, a gesture so tender and so completely at odds with everything the camp had witnessed from this animal over the past year, that nobody watching could quite believe what their own eyes were showing them. Lily wrapped both arms around the horse's lowered neck, pressing her face against his mane, and for a long moment, neither the girl nor the horse moved at all, standing together in the center of the yard, as though the chaos around them had simply ceased to exist. Nobody in the crowd spoke. Nobody moved. Barlow stood frozen with the rope still clutched in his hand, his mouth slightly open, staring at a scene he could not possibly have predicted even a few minutes earlier. Grace lowered her own hand slowly, from where she had reached out instinctively to intervene, her heart still pounding from the fear of what might have happened, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes as she watched the horse and the girl standing together, utterly calm, utterly connected, in a way that no rope or method or careful training session had ever come close to achieving. "How?" Barlow finally managed to say, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "Did she do that?" Grace turned toward him slowly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "Because she's the only person left in this camp who knows his real name." Barlow stared at her, uncomprehending, then looked back toward the center of the yard, where Barley stood as gentle and still as any farm animal, his massive head resting against the shoulder of a girl small enough to stand entirely within the shadow of his frame. The soldiers who had gathered ropes and poles moments earlier now lowered them slowly, uncertain what to do with the sudden, overwhelming calm that had settled over the yard. Peter Doyle, still standing near the broken fence, let out a long breath he had apparently been holding since the moment the chaos began. Lily finally lifted her head from where it had been pressed against Barley's mane and looked toward Barlow, her eyes red from crying, but her expression steady and unafraid. "Please," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent yard. "Don't send him away. He's not dangerous. He was never dangerous. He was just waiting." Barlow looked at the girl, then at the horse standing calm and gentle beside her, then finally at Grace, whose expression made it clear that whatever explanation existed behind this moment was far more complicated than anyone in the camp had realized. "Waiting for what?" Barlow asked quietly. Lily rested her hand once more against Barley's neck, right over the faded mark hidden beneath his mane, and looked up at the commanding officer with an expression far older than her 10 years. "For someone to remember who he really was," she said, "before all of this." The transport wagon left Camp Ashford that afternoon, with its bed completely empty, the driver shaking his head in confusion as he steered the tired horses back toward the main road. Barlow had made the decision quickly, standing in the yard with Lily's hand still resting against Barley's neck, and the entire camp watching in stunned silence. Whatever paperwork existed to send the horse to frontline transport duty would simply have to be corrected. No animal that had just demonstrated this kind of gentleness, however briefly, was going to be shipped off to a dangerous and uncertain future without at least a chance to prove that the change was real. That evening, with the broken fence repaired and the yard finally quiet again, Barlow called Grace and Lily to his small office near the center of the camp. He sat behind a worn wooden desk covered in maps and supply reports, gesturing for them both to sit in the 2 chairs across from him. "I want to understand everything," he said, "from the beginning. Lily glanced nervously at Grace, who nodded encouragingly, and slowly, haltingly at first, but with growing confidence, the girl told her story. She explained that her family had owned a modest farm in a quiet valley, several days' journey from Camp Ashford, where they raised horses known throughout the region for their strength and gentle temperament. Her father managed the breeding, her mother ran the household, and her older brother, a young man named Daniel Hartman, had taken on the responsibility of caring for the horses from the time he was barely older than Lily herself was now. Daniel had been present the night Barley was born, she explained, and from that very first night, an unusual bond had formed between the boy and the foal. Daniel fed him by hand, slept in the barn beside him during storms, and spent every free hour teaching him to trust human touch through nothing but patience and gentle repetition. By the time Barley was fully grown, he had become the gentlest and most reliable horse on the entire farm, calm enough for even the youngest children to ride, strong enough to work the fields for hours without complaint. Everything changed when the fighting reached their region. Soldiers began moving through the countryside, gathering horses, supplies, and able-bodied young men for the war effort. When a group of soldiers arrived at the Hartman farm, demanding horses for military transport, Daniel had fought desperately to keep Barley from being taken, pleading with the officers, offering every other horse on the farm in exchange. But the soldiers needed strength above all else, and Barley, fully grown and powerfully built, was exactly what they were looking for. Lily remembered watching from the barn door as Daniel was forced back at the point of a rifle while soldiers led Barley away on a rope, the horse screaming and fighting the entire time, clearly terrified and confused by the sudden separation from the only human he had ever trusted completely. "That was the last time any of us saw him," Lily said quietly. "Daniel tried to follow, but our father held him back. He said it was too dangerous, that the soldiers would not hesitate to hurt him if he interfered further." Not long after that, the fighting reached their valley directly. Lily's family farm was caught in the crossfire of a larger conflict, and within days, their home and barns were destroyed. Her parents made the desperate decision to send Lily away with a neighboring family who were fleeing toward what they believed would be a safer region, hoping to follow soon after, with Daniel, once the immediate danger had passed. But the journey had been chaotic and dangerous, and somewhere along the way, Lily became separated from the neighboring family during a sudden skirmish between opposing forces. She had wandered alone for nearly 2 weeks before a supply convoy from Camp Ashford found her sheltering in an abandoned farmhouse, exhausted, hungry, and completely alone. "I don't know what happened to my parents," Lily admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know if Daniel ever made it out safely, or if he's still looking for me somewhere, or if—" She stopped, unable to finish the thought aloud. Grace reached over and placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder, and Lily took a steadying breath before continuing. "When I saw Barley being dragged back into his pen that first day, covered in mud, fighting against everyone around him, I recognized the mark on his neck immediately. It's the same mark my father burned into every horse born on our farm. I knew it was him, even though he looked so different, so angry, so lost." Barlow sat quietly for a long moment, processing everything he had just heard. He glanced toward Grace, who nodded slowly in confirmation of the story. "I've watched her with him every night for the past 2 weeks," Grace said. "What happened today in the yard was not luck or coincidence. That horse has been waiting this entire time, not for training or discipline, but for someone connected to the life he lost. Lily is the closest thing to that connection he has left." Barlow rubbed a hand across his tired face, considering everything carefully. "This changes the situation considerably," he finally said. "I cannot in good conscience send an animal away simply for defending itself against confusion and fear, especially not when there's clearly a path toward genuine trust." He looked directly at Lily. "You understand this does not mean he becomes a household pet. He's still a powerful animal, and this camp still has real work that needs doing. But if you're willing to continue what you've started, I'm willing to give this a proper chance." Lily's eyes brightened with a hope that had clearly been missing from her expression for a very long time. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said immediately. "I just don't want him to be alone anymore." Over the following weeks, the transformation at Camp Ashford was gradual but unmistakable. Lily continued her nightly visits to Barley's pen, though now she was permitted to visit openly during the day as well, without fear of punishment or suspicion. Grace worked alongside her, carefully rebuilding the training methods that had failed before, but this time incorporating Lily's presence and the horse's clear preference for gentleness over force. Barley never fully lost the powerful, watchful nature that had made him so difficult to control in those first months at the camp. He remained alert, cautious around unfamiliar soldiers, and unwilling to tolerate rough handling of any kind. But with Lily nearby, something in him settled in a way that nothing else had managed to achieve. He allowed Grace to work with him during their sessions, gradually accepting a saddle, a bridle, and eventually the gentle weight of a rider on his back, always calmer and more cooperative whenever Lily stood somewhere within his sight. Peter Doyle, who had been thrown across the yard on that very first chaotic morning, became one of the first soldiers to approach the pen without fear, drawn by curiosity about the animal's remarkable change. Over time, he became one of Barley's regular caretakers, learning from both Grace and Lily how to earn the horse's trust through patience rather than force. The other children who occasionally passed through the camp with refugee families or supply convoys were eventually allowed to visit as well, always supervised, always careful, but genuinely delighted to discover a horse gentle enough to nuzzle apples from their small palms, the same way he once had on a farm that no longer existed. Word of the remarkable horse and the young girl who had tamed him with nothing but patience and a whispered name began to spread beyond the walls of Camp Ashford, carried along supply routes, and passed between soldiers moving between outposts. Some exaggerated the story into something closer to legend, but the core of it remained simple and true. A beast that had defied every soldier, every rope, and every method the camp could offer had finally been reached, not through strength or discipline, but through a single word spoken by a child who refused to give up on him. Months later, when the fighting in the region finally began to calm and travel between outposts became somewhat safer, Barlow arranged for a small group, including Grace, Lily, and 2 soldiers as escort, to travel back toward the valley where the Hartman farm once stood. Lily had asked, quietly but persistently, for the chance to see what remained of her home, and Barlow, seeing how far she had come and how much she deserved this small kindness, had finally agreed. They rode out early one clear morning, Lily seated proudly astride Barley for the very first time since his return to her life, Grace riding alongside on a calmer, older horse from the camp stables. The journey took the better part of 2 days, winding through quiet countryside, slowly recovering from the fighting that had swept through it months earlier. When they finally reached the valley, Lily's breath caught at the sight of the farm, or what remained of it. The barns were little more than blackened frames, the fields overgrown with wild grass, the farmhouse itself reduced to a low stone foundation surrounded by scattered, weathered debris. It was not the joyful homecoming she might once have imagined, but there was a strange peace in simply seeing it again, in standing on the same ground where she had once been happy, with Barley standing steady and calm beneath her. She dismounted slowly and walked toward the remains of the barn, running her hand along a scorched wooden beam that had somehow survived the fire mostly intact. Barley followed her closely, his large head lowered, nudging gently at her shoulder, as though sensing the weight of the moment. "This is where you were born," Lily said softly, resting her hand against his neck. "Right here, in this barn, on a night my brother said was colder than any he could remember." She stood quietly for a long time, simply remembering, allowing herself to grieve everything that had been lost, while also recognizing, perhaps for the first time since that terrible day the soldiers first arrived, that not everything precious from her old life had been taken from her after all. Grace approached quietly, giving the girl space, but staying close enough to offer comfort if needed. "Any sign of your family?" she asked gently, already suspecting the answer, based on the desolate scene around them. Lily shook her head slowly. "No, but I didn't really expect to find them here. Maybe someday, when things are calmer, we can search further. Maybe Daniel is out there somewhere, still looking for me too." Her voice carried a quiet hope rather than despair, a resilience that had clearly grown alongside her renewed bond with Barley. "We'll help you look," Grace said firmly, "for as long as it takes." As the sun began to lower toward the horizon, casting long golden light across the overgrown fields, Lily climbed back onto Barley's back, and the small group began their journey back toward Camp Ashford. She glanced back once at the ruins of her childhood home, feeling a mixture of sorrow and unexpected peace settle over her, before turning her attention forward, toward whatever came next. Back at the camp, Barley eventually became something far more than simply a rehabilitated warhorse. He became a quiet symbol of a truth that many soldiers, hardened by months and years of conflict, had perhaps forgotten somewhere along the way. Strength and fear could force an animal, or even a person, into temporary submission, but only patience, memory, and genuine connection could truly reach someone who had been hurt badly enough to stop trusting the world around them entirely. Lily continued to grow up within the camp's walls, eventually becoming known throughout the region not simply as the girl who tamed an untamable horse, but as someone with a rare gift for understanding creatures and people who had been pushed to their absolute limits. She never forgot her family, never stopped hoping that Daniel might someday be found, but she carried her grief differently after that day in the yard, lighter somehow, balanced by the steady, comforting presence of the one piece of her old life that had somehow found its way back to her. And Barley, once feared throughout Camp Ashford as an untamable beast that no rope or soldier could control, spent the rest of his days as gentle and steady as the quiet valley where he had been born, proving to everyone who had once doubted him that the fiercest resistance in the world could still be undone by nothing more than a single, familiar word, whispered softly, by someone who had never stopped remembering his name.